See you again. Hi,
Shalom.
Professor, my good professor. We're all ears.
They don't know, they didn't call it. That's all right. Ask me, so.
Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, first of all. Welcome to the Foreign Ministry. If you'd like to take your seats. We're gathered today to mark International Human Rights Day, which is actually marked tomorrow and Friday. At this press conference, NGO Monitor will be presenting the Deputy Foreign Minister with their latest study, Lawfare. And first of all, we'll invite NGO Monitor's two representatives, Professor Gerald Steinberg and Anne Herzberg, to deliver short introductions. And then we will allow the Deputy Foreign Minister to give an overview of the diplomatic consequences of lawfare and its implications for peace. So I'd like to ask Professor Steinberg to start the proceedings.
Deputy Foreign Minister Ayalon, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow marks International Human Rights Day. It is supposed to be the celebration of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, on December 10th, 1948. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written and adopted in the shadow of the horrors of the Holocaust. It was part of what we thought at the time was an international resolve not to allow the immorality that took place in those dark years to be repeated. The International Declaration of Human Rights included solemn pledges by the signatories, the members of the international community, to promote and respect and enforce human rights, and to act with force if necessary to prevent abuses, discrimination, racism, and other acts of xenophobia. However, 62 years later, we see that this moral and universal document has been distorted and exploited entirely beyond recognition. For many of us, this is not a day of celebration, but a day of tragedy, to mark the failure of the international community in many areas to implement these noble words and intentions of 1948. Many of the same organizations that claim to act in the name of human rights and claim their mandates from the Universal Declaration are precisely those that are doing the greatest damage. The United Nations Human Rights Council, which was reformed to replace the Commission on Human Rights 5 years ago, continues to display in every one of its sessions a built-in bias against not only Israel, but against democratic societies. The inherent strength, the control exerted by the Organization of the Islamic Conference and other countries which are precisely those that lack democratic freedoms and implementing of human rights, are the ones that control the agenda. And they are supported in many of these activities by a wide range of non-governmental organizations that have taken on the claims and the language and the rhetoric of human rights, unfortunately without the substance. It is this combination of the Islamic Conference-controlled Human Rights Council and the non-governmental organizations that have consistently used analogies comparing Israeli responses to terrorism to Nazi-like behavior, that use terms like apartheid or abuse terms like apartheid, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, collective punishment, for partisan political purposes that are the exact antithesis of the goals of the the Human Rights Declaration. This immoral inversion was recently denounced by Robert Bernstein, the founder of Human Rights Watch, who called his own organization to task for allowing itself to be part of these abuses, and particularly for helping turn Israel into a pariah state through the false claims of human rights abuses and the abuse of the language of international law. In 2001, we saw 1,500 organizations claiming to promote human rights gathering under a United Nations flag and banner in Durban, South Africa, to use that framework to focus and to target Israel with this kind of language, again showing the close connection between the organizations, non-governmental organizations, groups that claim to be supporting human rights, and the United Nations human rights mechanisms. Their goal, in many cases clearly proclaimed, is the dismantling of the State of Israel, clearly in itself a racist and discriminatory objective, entirely inconsistent with the moral aspirations of the Human Rights Declaration. Their reports are often based on false claims, on double standards, on exploitation of the language of international law and human rights from 2002 in Geneva through the Goldstone and Flotilla campaigns. What we see consistently is an obsessive agenda, the double standards, which focus human rights language against democracies in general and Israel in particular, while patronizing the dictatorships that are the greatest abusers of human rights. When we have tomorrow, I almost said we celebrate, but when we mark tomorrow International Human Rights Day, unfortunately, based on past experience, we do not see these many organizations with their powerful ability to influence international public opinion, their large budgets, their huge PR operations, marching in solidarity demanding the freedom for Gilad Shalit. Tomorrow in Tel Aviv there will be a demonstration by the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Judges outside the building of the International Red Cross. Perhaps we will see some members of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and many other organizations out there in solidarity. That's where they should be if they really care about human rights. The powerful NGO community, supported by hundreds of millions of dollars and euros from European governments and from private foundations, many of which sincerely think they are promoting human rights, has failed to promote these important values and instead has been diverted into, in many cases, doing the opposite work in this area. NGO Monitor was founded in after the Durban Conference of 2001 to report on these activities, to provide a different voice, to provide the missing guidelines, checks and balances, accountability, to point out where there are double standards, to ask whether the information and the legal frameworks are that they choose, that they quote, are in fact accurate, are in fact sourced, are in fact reflect the information at hand. Unfortunately, in many of our research reports, we find that that is not the case. My colleague, Ann Herzberg, will soon present the results of her detailed report on the abuse of the language of international law in cases that are called lawfare, a form of political warfare directed against Israeli officials under false pretenses and false claims in the international legal framework, funded by these powerful organizations. And we will also see that this is not simply directed against Israel. American, European, NATO officials are also targeted through this process. And it's important, as we come to International Human Rights Day, to also note the abuses of the language and the failure to implement the moral frameworks which were adopted and which were so strongly proclaimed in 1948. Deputy Minister Ayalon, I have the honor of presenting you with our report on NGO Lawfare, and we look forward to responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Ayalon, for giving me the opportunity today to share the results of my research. I've been detailing Lawfare for several years now, and the study that we're issuing today is actually an update from one that I had published a couple years ago. It details several ways in which legal frameworks have been exploited in the Arab-Israeli conflict, including at the UN, most notably the Human Rights Council, the Goldstone process that we're all familiar with, the International Criminal Court, and war crimes lawsuits that have been filed against Israelis in countries such as Spain and the UK, which have been so prominent in the news. These strategies have actually been around for decades, most notably used by states at UN bodies. Today, however, we see these strategies have been adopted by several organizations that claim the mantle of human rights and humanitarian objectives. The study documents how these campaigns are being funded, perhaps unwittingly, and in some cases intentionally, by the European Union, several European governments, church organizations, and prominent foundations like George Soros's Open Society Institute and the Ford Foundation. And I'm going to speak now a little bit about the war crimes cases that have been filed against Israelis, which comprise about half of the report. These cases have been filed throughout Europe and North America, also in New Zealand, and they generally fall within two categories: the attempts to arrest or impose civil liability on Israeli officials for alleged war crimes, and cases against corporations and governments that have diplomatic relations with Israel to seek judicially imposed arms embargoes or trade sanctions against Israel. As Gerald Steinberg mentioned, it's important to note that Israel is not the only country that has been targeted by these lawsuits. U.S. and UK officials have also been victims. So a lot of the information I'm about to relate to you is also relevant for the cases against those officials. It's also important to note that these cases are generally filed in courts where there was no connection between the country in which the court sits and the events and the individuals at issue. So these cases are asking foreign courts to rule on cases that are wholly foreign. The primary actors involved in these cases are the Gaza-based Palestinian Center for Human Rights, the Ramallah-based Al-Haq, and the New York-based Center for Constitutional Rights. You may have heard of the Center for Constitutional Rights because they also recently filed a case in the U.S. to block the targeted killing of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and that case was actually dismissed a couple days ago by the U.S. court. CCR has also been involved in filing cases against U.S. officials in France and Germany over the Iraq War. These organizations are aided in their efforts by large NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Federation of Human Rights from France. To date, all of the cases that I document in the study have been dismissed, but they are filed more for their PR and associative impacts to link Israel or other Western countries with the concept of war crimes. Now I'm going to turn to one prime example of the strategy that's detailed in the study. So the Palestinian Center for Human Rights has filed numerous jurisdiction cases against several Israeli officials over the July 2002 targeted killing of Hamas leader Salah Shehadeh, who had orchestrated terror attacks that killed and wounded many hundreds of people. PCHR has tried to have Israeli leaders arrested in the UK, in Spain, in New Zealand, and in the U.S. has tried to impose civil liability, including punitive damages, against Avi Dichter in the U.S. Many of the plaintiffs that have been recruited for these cases have also filed suit in Israel, but chose to abandon their cases here. Although it labels itself as a human rights organization, PCHR frequently calls attacks on Israeli civilians to be legal forms of resistance. What was perhaps most surprising about my research in these cases was that PCHR was able to file these cases thanks to a €300,000 grant from the European Union that was channeled to PCHR from the organization Oxfam Novib. No information relating to the distribution of this funding to PCHR is available on publicly available EU documents. The grant was given under the EU's Abolition for the Death Penalty project, and the objective of the grant and I'm quoting here, was to contribute to the eradication of the death penalty applied by the Palestinian Authority and extrajudicial executions by the Israeli military. None of the other 28 projects funded under this program dealt with military operations or targeted killings. PCHR and Oxfam used this funding to hold strategy conferences with their lawyers in Spain, in Egypt, and the UK, and afterwards were involved in filing lawsuits in some of those places. Banners displayed at the conferences that were often called impunity for Israeli war criminals, and there's an example in your packets, clearly show the logos of Oxfam and the EU prominently displayed. When an independent evaluation was conducted of these 28 projects funded under the death penalty program, the auditors noted that it was impossible to make any useful comment on the Oxfam PCHR program because they found that there were few substantive documents in the file. This was the only program out of the 28 that had no information available, and therefore there was no oversight over this program or what PCHR was doing with the money. In 2010, Oxfam and PCHR received a second grant for close to €1 million. Again, no information is publicly available regarding this grant, and it is unclear whether PCHR will continue to use this funding to bring its lawsuits. And I just want to highlight several of the damaging and lasting impacts that these lawsuits have. They cause serious interference with diplomatic relations and embarrassment for the countries involved. They often are filed without the knowledge of any government officials and allow radical political actors to interfere in foreign relations without any sort of democratic check. So in the UK, for instance, and this is the bill that's being amended right now, any private individual could go to a magistrate judge and seek an arrest warrant of any foreign official. These campaigns not only target Israel, but they also attack mutually beneficial relations between Israel and its allies. For instance, many of these cases seek to judicially impose sanctions or trade embargoes, as I mentioned, and they call for the suspension of mutually beneficial trade agreements like the EU-Israel Association Agreement. So by these actions, they're not only harming Israelis, but they're also harming the citizens of the countries where these lawsuits are being filed. These campaigns serve to radicalize both sides of the conflict. They discourage cooperation and coexistence initiatives, and they ultimately make a negotiated solution to the conflict more difficult to achieve. The EU funding for Israel's targeted killings policy actually is an attack on international law that may very well undermine NATO's own targeted killing operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And finally, these cases bolster asymmetric warfare and may in the future actually lead to greater civilian casualties. The cases detailed in the study highlight the need for oversight of public funding for these campaigns. And it's important to ensure that further funding that is channeled to these organizations is not used for purposes that inflame the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Anne was relating, this is the study that her and Professor Steinberg were relating to. You can find copies over here. There's other executive summaries in English and in Hebrew. So I'd like to ask the Deputy Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon to give his remarks.
Shalom, good afternoon. Welcome to the ministry here in Jerusalem. I want to thank the NGO Monitor organization. I want to thank Professor Steinberg and Amy Herzberg for this work that has been done, and which we will study very, very carefully. But I can tell you that without looking into the details yet of the report, which we have just been receiving, so naturally we cannot make any reference to any specific organization or any specific country that funds those organizations. As I said, these details will be studied very carefully by us. I would say that even before Dr. Steinberg, before even this document, which I regard very much, and it's a very important one, it was quite clear that the entire NGO system, and especially the human rights organizations, mostly have been manipulated today and have been used either by terror organizations or other elements for two things. First of all, to cover for their own atrocities. And secondly, to actually try and strip the right for self-defense from democracies. The Goldstone report is a case in point whereby we have seen a terror organization like Hamas, which is in no way different than Al-Qaeda or many other terror organizations in the world, that we saw that Hamas not only was conducting the most heinous criminal activities and war crimes by embedding themselves in and among civil populations, they also attacked Israeli civil populations, almost exclusively attacking civil populations, and then, of course, try, whether it's their terror organizations or with the aid of Palestinian Authority and other enemies of Israel and peace, try to actually turn the table and depict the entire wrong picture and put Israel on the blame as the war criminal. So I think today, as we are in the eve of this International Day for Human Rights, I think bona fide, and we realize that there are many, many good bona fide human rights organizations and NGOs which have been created with good reason and which are working really with good faith. But they have to ask themselves, are they really fulfilling the purpose for which they have been created? Are they not being manipulated and being used as a tool or as pawns in this political warfare, judicial warfare that is being waged against Israel here or in other areas of conflicts in the world, as we see, whether it was in Iraq or in Afghanistan and other areas of the world. So really they have to ask themselves the moral questions. Are they really fulfilling their mission of human rights? Are they checking the real abuse of human rights in closed societies, in societies which are not democracies, democracies which are very much able and keen on self-criticism, on transparency, on accountability, and of course there are cases all over the world, but the strength and power of democracies is that these cases can be flushed out and be taken care of. But what happens to the real problems and abuse of women's rights, of teenagers, or children's rights, or minority rights in so many countries of the world which maybe do not even allow entrance for bona fide human rights organizations or delegations, emissaries, representatives to go and check, where their lives are being threatened if they even try to have a report in such countries. Iran, case in point, Libya, and many, many others which I will not mention. So these real bona fide human rights organizations have to ask themselves the moral questions. Are they really true to their mandate? Are they true to their cause? Are they true to the values? Are they true to the interests of humanity? This is the most important thing. Of course, there are some organizations, whether they're NGO, human rights, which are rogue organizations. And I think it will be very interesting to learn this report, where they get their fundings. But it's not just a day of reckoning for human rights organizations and NGOs tomorrow. I think it's also a day for countries, respectable countries which fund many of these organizations. And they have to ask the political questions: are they doing the right thing? Any nation that funds NGOs that attack, whether it's Israel or other democracies, and support the Bds Campaign, the boycotts, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel in this case, is simply against peace. No nation can dismiss their role when they give $1 or €1 to an organization which viciously delegitimizes Israel. The leaders of the Bds campaign have said openly that they do not seek a two-state solution for two peoples. Omar Barghouti, the leader and the founder, actually, of this the Bds campaign, or the Bds movement. By the way, he is also a student of, incidentally, of Tel Aviv University. Omar Barghouti, Mr. Barghouti, says openly that he is against the two-state solution and peaceful coexistence between Arabs and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians. He says, and I quote, "If the occupation ends, would that mean an end to my call for BDS? No, it will not." End of quote. So here I say again, any nation funding an organization involved in the Bds campaign is against peace, regardless of the amount of funding or declarations of ignorance. We say to every nation involved with such an organization quite simply, you paid for it, you own it, and there are no excuses. BDS doesn't just work against Israel, it is an enemy of peace. It is part, unfortunately, it is a part of a Palestinian cycle of evasion and rejectionism, and allows them to hope that their maximalistic demands are met without having to concede or negotiate on a good faith manner on a single issue. If I can kind of deviate to the current situation or the current state of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, it is obvious that they are at impasse, not that we will give up, and we will continue to follow and look up to American leadership and involvement. And I believe that some ways will be found to overcome this impasse. But every nation around the world, as I mentioned, has to ask a simple question: are they working towards peace or assisting in the continuation of this conflict? And there are no really other options here. The artificial and unilateral declaration of a new state of Palestine, which is being now promulgated by the Palestinian leadership, this will not bring peace, but could conceivably make the conflict far, far more serious. The only way to peace is a negotiated solution agreed to by both parties on two-state solutions for two peoples. Every other way, whether it is unilateral declarations of statehood or an imposed peace, will only lead to more bloodshed and pain. For 17 years, Israel has never hesitated to meet with the Palestinians anytime, anywhere, to discuss anything. The Palestinians, on the other hand, have perpetuated a cycle of evasion, transigence, and rejectionism. Their strategy is all too familiar and has repeated itself for many years. And we see a strategy. Firstly, the Palestinians look for any excuse to avoid negotiations, creating excuse after excuse. They purposefully, and I think very callously, evaded negotiations after the very generous concession, difficult concession for Israel, of a moratorium for 10 months on settlement activities. It didn't help. They still did not come to the table. Secondly, while running away from the negotiation table, they attempt to place the onus and blame on Israel. Third part of this strategy, as we see, is that they threaten Israel and the international community with unilateralism. And finally, the Palestinians attempt to smear and attack Israel in any and every forum. And this is the main relevance of this very dangerous strategy of the Palestinians to the issue today on international rights and negotiations. They manipulate, they use it not to move forward, and actually these NGOs, this human rights community, whether by default or by design, give a cover to the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians to continue with this evasion, rejectionism, and with trying to put the onus on Israel. So they do not have to come and discuss among themselves and make the decisions that they have to make. Israel has made its own painful decisions. We have compromised throughout the last 17 years, not only in the sense that we have agreed on a two-state solution, an independent Palestinian state, which is not something which was automatic or inevitable or something that had not been needed some discussion here, and many other issues. So, lastly, in this important day, as we mark the International Human Rights Day, I also would like to mention the one person in our region that has no human rights at all. And this is Gilad Shalit. Gilad Shalit should be the most burning issue on the international agenda. Here is a young man caged like an animal by terrorists without the right to see the light of day, or to receive communications from loved ones, or even receive a visit by the Red Cross or any other human rights organizations, which I am not sure have made any attempt to come and visit and see him or report about his conditions. If the continued imprisonment of Gilad Shalit is not made a major issue by every human rights organization around the world on International Human Rights Day tomorrow, then it will make this entire day a mockery. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll have time for some questions. If when you ask the question, if you could indicate your name, the media outlet you are working for, and also the person you're directing your question to. Yes, at the back.
Gallagher Fenwick, France 24. Mr. Deputy Foreign Minister, could you give us your assessment of where negotiations stand at the present moment? And second question about the Turkish-Israeli relations. We're hearing that Israel might be getting ready to compensate families and offer, if not an apology, an expression of regret. Can you tell us whether or not that's speculation, or can you confirm?
Issue of negotiations, well, there are none at this moment. This is not to say that we will not continue to seek other ways. We have tried, and we still believe that the best way to move forward is to have direct negotiations on a continuous basis without any preconditions, where all issues are on the table and we are willing to trade concessions with the Palestinians. However, this was not to be. We have been waiting for the Palestinians now for over a year and a half, and at this moment, I believe we will all look for other ways. I think it is important to continue the political process. I don't think there is any alternative or substitute to a political process. So this is why the next days and weeks, we will all use our energy and thoughts together with our friends and allies in the international community, first and foremost the United States, to find other ways, whether it is proximity talks, whether they are indirect talks, which ultimately will lead to direct talks. I also believe that, given the experience that we have had, that maybe we should keep any of these contacts away from the public eye, not because there is anything to hide, but I guess it added some undue complications, and maybe we should use these channels and get some firm understandings and formats before we take it into the public eye. As to Turkey, please allow me not to make any reference. The negotiations or the contacts between the Israeli representative, Mr. Chikhanover, and his counterpart from Turkey are not concluded, so I don't think it would be any useful for me to make any comments on that. Thank you.
Yes.
Chris Mitchell with CBN News. Two questions. First for Deputy Foreign Minister Ayalon. Can you expound on your statements about the recent declarations by Argentina and Brazil recognizing a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders? And do you see this as perhaps a coordinated effort by the Palestinian Authority and sympathetic nations to go ahead and do that? With a question to Professor Steinberg and Ann Herzberg, do you see this lawfare as a coordinated attempt by what they call Green-Red Alliance, by a combination of Islamic groups and liberal groups?
Well, thank you, Chris. Well, first of all, it is very deplorable, these letters that were sent by Brazil and Argentina, and now I believe Uruguay, to the Palestinians. I think that not only it was a political mistake, they really fell into a Palestinian trap here, because certainly the solution here in the Middle East will not be dictated in faraway places, whether it's in Buenos Aires or Montevideo or anywhere else. The solution will be, the only solution will be found here through negotiations between the parties in a bona fide and way. So again, this is showing the Palestinians' way of evading the tough decisions. We have to make tough decisions. We have made tough decisions. We are continuing to make more tough decisions in compromises with the Palestinians. We do not see any compromise on the Palestinians or any willingness to debate or discuss among themselves. You know, what are they willing to give for peace? So far, they ask the maximalistic. By the way, they have not changed their position 1 inch since '93 until now. If you look at the Israeli position since '93 until now, you see the evolution where we are now, forthcoming towards the Palestinians. We don't see a reciprocal approach, and instead we see their attempt to create international pressure on Israel, such as these letters from Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. This is not helpful, on the contrary, because this will give the Palestinians this illusion that they can forever evade the tough decisions, and thinking that Israel will concede or will buckle under international pressure. This will not be. So Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay are very good friends of Israel. They will remain very good friends of Israel. We make a distinction, complete decoupling between our bilateral relations with them, which are very good, and the conflict with the Palestinians. We will not let the Palestinians or the conflict to mar or jar any of the bilateral relations that we had, but this is very deplorable, and again, I think it could be very, very not helpful to move forward, and de facto, it is meaningless. It is meaningless because it is not and will not change, does not and will not change the reality on the ground. So I believe at the end of the day, the unilateral threat by the Palestinians to declare a Palestinian state, which, by the way, if I may evoke your memory, they have already declared an independent Palestinian state back in 1988 in Geneva by Arafat. So it may continue to do that, and it will stay as a virtual declaration without any meaning. I think it's important for the international community to convey this message to the Palestinians and not fall into this trap again, which will just be harmful for peace and will not only it will not further peace 1 iota, it will take things backwards. Please.
The alliance between Islamic governments, the conference, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the organizations that they are able to control, like the United Nations Human Rights Council and other frameworks like that, with organizations and frameworks that have appropriated the language of human rights and democracy and peace. That's sometimes called the Green-Red Alliance. And I think we see it in many different examples. Just to carry on the issue of how this links to the attempts to avoid a serious peace process, it is the Arab League and the Palestinian Authority that went initially to the International Criminal Court and claimed the status that would allow the International Criminal Court, in a very distorted manner, to open up cases against Israelis under the claims, allegations of war crimes. And it's the NGOs that claim to promote human rights and democracy and freedom that have joined with the Arab League and our peace partners, the Palestinian Authority, in this process taking place in the International Criminal Court. It's in the flotilla, the clash, the tragic clash that ended with the deaths of 9 people, the flotilla that had members of the IHH, a very violent group, that were based in Turkey, supported by and working closely with the International Solidarity Movement, which is solidarity for the Palestinians, basically what's called a one-state formula, which means the elimination of the State of Israel, clearly in itself a racist and discriminatory platform. And that was the basis for that what was called euphemistically the Free Gaza Flotilla, which led to that clash that was mentioned earlier, under the facade of humanitarian aid. So certainly that alliance is very potent, and unfortunately I think that the organizations that are supposed to be and claim the mandate of morality, of human rights and democracy in that combination have not, at least not until now, disassociated themselves from these abuses. In fact, they have been very much part of this process in many different ways. BDS that the Deputy Minister mentioned, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, we also see this combination between a very powerful organization called the Electronic Intifada and the people who are involved in that. A gentleman by the name of Ali Abu Nima in particular, who appears in many, many campuses and frameworks preaching the boycott, divestment, sanctions, and one state, eliminate the State of Israel solution. So there you have, again, this combination of both a Palestinian, Arab, Islamic framework, but also joining with many of the organizations that have appropriated the language of democracy, human rights, and peace in doing this kind of political warfare through the delegitimization of Israel, and as Professor Erwin Kotler has said, use of terms like apartheid. Professor Erwin Kotler, who was the Justice Minister of Canada, one of the premier experts in human rights around the world, who said that when you appropriate the language of apartheid and the suffering of the people in South Africa under apartheid, and you abuse that to demonize the State of Israel, what you're really doing is calling for the dismantling of the State of Israel, in itself a racist act.
I would also just add, in terms of universal jurisdiction cases, last year a Hamas-created organization was able to secure an arrest warrant against Tzipi Livni in the UK. And that was a direct outgrowth of the cases that had been filed by Palestinian Center for Human Rights. So that is a very direct manifestation of this Red-Green Alliance, as you called it. And I would also add that these cases also actually bolster the ability of Hamas and Hezbollah to fight asymmetrical war, because they are basically, they don't condemn Hamas and Hezbollah for their tactics of embedding within civilian areas, hiding their weapons within mosques and schools and hospitals. And by filing these cases, they're actually encouraging that activity, which in the future can only lead to further civilian casualties. So I would say that's the direct connection.
Zini, Ynet News. I would like to address Deputy Minister Ayalon. I would like to ask you whether you personally think that we should apologize in front of Turkey for the results of the flotilla.
Short answer is no.
First here and then there.
Well, long answers also.
Since officials are not commenting on it, I would like to very much your comment be on that question now that this discussion is being hit quite hot between Israel and Turkey on that matter? Should Israel, in your opinion, apologize, offer all kinds of money or whatever it is that they're demanding now? Would like to hear what you think about this issue in regards in this day when talking about things that are close to some sort of a compromise being reached.
Since I am sitting
Please
here...
if you could closer to the microphone, it would be highly appreciated.
This is not going to help you very much because I'm going to say
yes,
that
you will.
Since I'm sitting here in the Foreign Ministry and we're talking about International Human Rights Day, I'm not going to go and say anything else about Israel and Turkey that I haven't already said in connection with the flotilla. If you want to talk to me privately, I may have something to say, I may not on this issue.
But I'm afraid that'd be the only chance we'll get to hear you from that. No.
Just in front.
סגן השר איילון, אני מבקש שאלה בעברית. כיצד משרד החוץ אמור לנצל את הנתונים, את הממצאים שהוצגו כאן היום ולפעול מול הממשלות באירופה? שאלה נוספת, כיצד זה ישליך על צוותי החשיבה, אותם צוותים ששוקדים או ישקדו על ניהול המשא ומתן מול הפלסטינים? ועוד שאלה לפרופסור סטיינברג, מה בדיוק הפסול הגדול שאתם רואים באותה פעילות של ארגונים לא ממשלתיים, הרי הם פועלים לפי החוק, מקבלים מימון חוקי, איפה כאן הפסול הגדול? תודה.
תודה. קודם כל, לגבי הפעילות של משרד החוץ, אז כמובן שאנחנו נלמד את הדוח בצורה מאוד מאוד יסודית. אנחנו גם, אם צריך, נמשיך ונחקור את העניין הזה, אבל אפילו בלי הדוח, אז אנחנו יודעים, כן, יש דברים שהם גלויים ישר לגבי המסע של הדלגיטימציה שהפלסטינים עורכים נגד ישראל, ואני לא רוצה כרגע להרחיב, היריעה תקצר כרגע לדבר על הכל. אבל ההשלכה של כל מסע הדלגיטימציה היא מאוד חמורה לתהליך השלום. היא למעשה מונעת התקדמות. היא מונעת התקדמות כי מצד אחד הפלסטינים משליכים את יהבם על חד צדדיות, על דחיקת ישראל לפינה, על הפעלת לחץ על ישראל, איומים על ישראל, במקום לתפוס את השור בקרניו ולדון איתנו בנושאים הרלוונטיים. זה דבר אחד. דבר שני, אנחנו בהחלט רואים במסע הדלגיטימציה כאיום רציני על האינטרסים של ישראל, על שלומה וביטחונה. זה גם איומים פוליטיים, זה גם איומים משפטיים, וזה גם איומים מדיניים, ולכן אנחנו נערכים ונמשיך להילחם עד חורמה בכל מסע הדלגיטימציה הזה. וחלק מהלוחמה הזאת זה תהיה גם, מהתגובה הישראלית, זה תהיה למידת הדוח, הסקת מסקנות אם צריך נגד ארגונים ספציפיים, וכמובן החשיפה היא מאוד חשובה כדי שגם אותן מדינות שאולי לא יודעות בדיוק מה הן מממנות ידעו את זה, ואז אני מקווה גם יופסק המימון.
אני מרחיב בדיוק בסוגיה של המימון, אחר כך אני ארחיב לסוגיה אחרת. ארגון ציבורי שפועל בתוך הציבור, אם זה לפני בתי המשפט, אם זה בהתארגנות של הפגנות, או בדיונים באוניברסיטאות, או כל מיני צורות שונות, גם במיוחד גם בחוץ לארץ, שמקבלת מימון בצורה לא שקופה, סליחה. שמענו עכשיו בדוגמה של הארגון הפלסטיני לזכויות האדם, שקיבל מימון בדרך לא דרך, שאנחנו גילינו בה מממשלות אירופיות, תחת הכותרת אחרת. איך התהליכים האלה קורים? איפה הפרוטוקולים? מי יושב בדיונים האלה של מדינות אירופיות שמחלקים ומחליטים על חלוקת הכסף? האם הדיונים האלה הם, ובתהליכי קבלת החלטות, משקפים את הכללים של ניהול תקין? בממשלת קנדה שפרסם פרסמה את המסמכים והפרוטוקולים, ראינו שארגונים שקיבלו כסף, קיבלו את זה בצורה שבכלל לא עונה על הדרישות של ניהול תקין. אני יכול לפרט באופן ספציפי אם אתה רוצה, אבל אני אומר שהבעיה של חוסר שקיפות, שמדובר על הון עתק, עשרות מיליוני לפחות יורו לשנה ופאונדס ומטבעות שונות, שהולכים לארגונים כדי לההל את התהליכים של המשפטים נגד, אם זה ציפי לבני או אם זה השרים בממשלת ישראל או אחרים, או כמובן אלופי צה"ל. אם אין שקיפות בתהליך קבלת ההחלטות, זה בהחלט לא מוסרי. והבעיה העיקרית, השנייה, זה הבעיה של מוסר. אני לא אומר שהם עוברים על החוק, אבל אפשר להיות חוקי ולהתנהג בצורה לא מוסרית, ואני חושב שכאן אנחנו רואים את זה בארגונים שמתיירמים ומשתמשים ומנצלים את הכותרת של זכויות האדם, או של שלום, או של דמוקרטיה, ובפועל פועלים בדיוק בצורה הפוכה. וזה, עם ארגון שטוען שפועל למען זכויות האדם אוניברסליים, ולא מוציא שום דבר כדי להגן על זכויות של גלעד שליט, בעיניי זה יכול להיות חוקי, אבל בוודאי זה לא מוסרי.
שלא קיבלנו תשובה קודם, אם אפשר התשובה הזאת לסגן השר דני אילון. אנחנו רואים שמדובר כאן בארגונים שפועלים עם הרבה מאוד כסף, משומנים וערוכים גם משפטית וגם אחרת ברחבי העולם, ופועלים עם הרבה שכל. האם ישראל, עם מה שיש לנו כאן, שכל יש, אבל השאלה אם יש כסף ויש יכולת להגיש תשובה, לעמוד בפני כל אותם ארגונים ולתת מענה, או שישראל הכי קרובה שאפשר בתחום הזה להרים ידיים?
לא, בהחלט. לא רק שישראל לא מרימה ידיים, למרות שאנחנו מכירים בעובדה שזה מסע מאוד קשה, זו מערכה מאוד מאוד קשה, שבהם הפלסטינים גם מנצלים את הרוב האוטומטי הערבי בארגונים בינלאומיים בעיקר, וכמו שאמרתי, ארגונים לזכויות אדם ו-NGOים אחרים שהם חלקם פשוט משוטים על ידם. בוודאי שישראל לא מרימה ידיים. אני חושב שעצם ההכרה והחשיפה של הרשת הזאת, וזאת רשת שהוקמה בצורה ממוסדת, זוהי רשת שפועלת בתאום, רשת בינלאומית נגדנו. ברגע שאנחנו חושפים את הרשת, זו חצי מהפתרון, כאשר ההמשך יהיה כמובן בנקיטת, אם צריך, גם צעדים משפטיים נגדם, גם כמובן חשיפת העובדות, וגם הקמת רשת נגדית של הגנה על ישראל, על שמה הטוב, שפשוט תציג את העובדות כמו שהן ללא כחל וסרק, וישראל לבדה, כמובן שישראל לבדה לא תוכל לעמוד במערכה הזאת, ולכן אנחנו פועלים לגייס גם מדינות מערביות נוספות וגם ארגונים נוספים, ככה שהם יהיו מכפילי כוח כדי להילחם במסע הדלגיטימציה הזה. תראה, הפעילות הסעודית היא מאוד מאוד מטרידה, היא אפילו מסוכנת. כי מצד אחד, כמו שאתה אומר, הם בהחלט מממנים פעילויות טרור, אפילו בצורה עקיפה. כן? כספים סעודיים מגיעים, אולי לא ממשלתיים, אבל מגיעים לחמאס, לצערנו הרב. ובו בזמן הם קפוצי אצבעות וידיים, כאשר זה מגיע לכספים לעם הפלסטיני, לרשות הפלסטינית. הסעודים בקושי רב ממלאים את חלקם בוועידת התורמות, ונותנים באמת כסף זעום לעומת מה שהם יכולים, דבר שהיה יכול מאוד לסייע גם לרשות הפלסטינית וגם לכלכלה הפלסטינית ביהודה ושומרון. הם לא עושים את זה, ומצד שני אנחנו רואים בהחלט זליגה של כספים סעודיים לחמאס ולארגוני טרור אחרים. זו פעילות חמורה, זו פעילות שגם תמוהה, אני לא בטוח שהיא עולה בקנה אחד למדיניות ולאינטרסים הסעודיים, אבל זו בעיה שאנחנו יודעים כבר הרבה זמן, ואני מאוד מאוד מקווה שהסעודים ייתנו את הדעת על העניין הזה, כי זה בהחלט לא משרת את האינטרסים שלהם.
Dave Bender, Xinhua China News Agency. For Mr. Steinberg, is there any options for Israel or other countries or NGOs, pro-Israel NGOs, to file countersuits against Hamas or Hezbollah officials in Europe and other countries to make their life harder, right, to get around? And for Mr. Ayalon, what options does Israel have, practically speaking, if in fact the Palestinians do declare a state and they've got a growing wave of support internationally for it? Thank you.
It is possible for people to bring cases against Hamas officials or Hezbollah officials. We don't see that happening at the moment. I don't know if that's the best way to proceed, that we have more and more lawsuits where we're trying to litigate foreign relations in the courts. But I think that that could be an outgrowth. If the UK does not amend its law, I could definitely foresee that that's where things will go.
Well, as for Israel options, there are many. Allow me not to express them at this moment, because this is still a hypothetical question, if the Palestinians indeed will materialize their threat. So far, I see it as a threat, as part of continuing to pressure Israel. This will not work. But I would say if they do opt for this unilateral step, then of course Israel will be completely free of its obligations. This actually will be an abrogation of all the agreements that have been achieved so far, and certainly we will be free to take our own unilateral steps.
I'd like to remind you to pick up a copy of the report in English and in Hebrew, and good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming.
יופי, ג'רי היה מצוין, תודה רבה, זה מאוד חדש.